Next, I'd like to welcome Brett Wolk to the stage. He, with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. Brett is going to talk to us about some recommendations for best utilizing the mulching tool through a synthesis of the latest science, practitioner knowledge, wild success story, and miserable or fantastic failures. Please welcome Brett.
Hello, thank you for inviting me, having me here. Appreciate all of the work the organizers did with this conference. I know how much work that is, and definitely kudos, going well. I'm here to talk about mulch, one of my pastimes, passions. Talked about it a lot. We heard about some mulching, saw some machines out in the Northeast. That was kind of cool, Phragmites in the wetlands. Some other things. So what do we know about mulch? Well, why are we doing it, right? It's because there's too many trees out there, and we need to have less trees. That's the fundamental crux of the problem that we talked about, the mega fires and the basic story of our forests. So there's lots of reasons to get rid of those little trees. Some of it is for forest restoration, forest resilience, for the ecological health. We want to do fire mitigation around homes, increase the fire suppression effectiveness. There's watershed protection. There's a lot of reasons to get rid of little trees. You could go on and on about the reasons to get rid of trees and why we want to do this. There's endless amounts of reasons to really cut trees, right? So why don't we just do it? What's so hard? I think everybody here knows this, but just to bring it up to scale for everybody on the same page, there's few markets, it's expensive, nobody wants to buy those little trees, so it costs a lot of money to get them out. It's hard, and everybody in this room, I think, would agree we'd like to just burn them up in a very efficient, controlled manner. But that's hard. Although I will note we're getting better. I see progress on the horizon. But it's still hard. So we turn to mulching. But do we always turn to mulching? When is it the best tool, and when do we want to do something else? When is it a miserable failure, and when is it a roaring success? Right? And it starts with what George said about your results. What do you want at the end? What are your objectives? And the better you can clarify those objectives, the happier we'll all be and get along together. Right? It leads to better management outcomes and facilitates that communication amongst partners of who you work with, among the public. It brings more of that credibility to what you're doing. The more detailed and drilling down, exactly what we heard this morning, drilling down on what you really want to accomplish, that helps, and it's worth your time and effort. So I'm going to get right to it. I don't have time. Here's the end of the story. With mulch, what we care about is when it burns. What's going to happen, right? And what we care about is the big mega fires. When the weather is severe, when those big fires happen, having the fuels on the ground instead of standing up can provide opportunities for changing fire behavior and potential fire suppression. It tends to have trade-offs where you might have more dire ecological consequences afterwards. Okay, you might, not always, it's complicated, is the moral of the story, right? But there are some benefits and trade-offs that we're going to talk about through the rest of the talk. So first, just what is mastication? What is mulching? Mastication is when you grind things up right there in place, and it's just straight one shot. There's lots of different machines that do it. They pretty much all, the research has shown, have similar impacts of these types of machines of just grinding things right in place. Chipping, however, I think, this is kind of a take-home message, is different. It's different in its ecological impacts. It's potentially different in its fire impacts. It's also economically and logistically different as far as the crew, the funding, the operations, the logistics of how you do it. It still takes biomass and rearranges it, but also with chipping you have the option to blow it into a van and take it away, which you don't with mastication. Importantly, the resultant mulch that you're putting on the forest is different as far as the size and the arrangement. Chips are all the same size. Mastication, it's whole pieces of tree trunks down to splinters and everything in between. So it has big implications for potential plant development as well as fire behavior. As as well as aesthetics too. So mulching, I'm lumping both of those for better or worse, chipping and mastication. But it rearranges the fuel, right? I think we all know this and acknowledge it. It takes it from standing vegetation, grinds it up into smaller pieces and put it on soil surface, and wood is not removed. So your fuel loading is not changed. It's just rearranged. So everybody wants to know, what's the magic number? What's the magic depth? How much is too much? Right? And I put plant cover up here. You could put fuel loading. You could put a number of different variables. With a little bit of mulch, you might have some benefits to the ecosystem actually. Right? You might increase the soil moisture. You might make plants happy like in your garden. Right? But then you're going to cross a threshold where nothing's going to grow. Okay? So here's some, sometimes it works out well. Where you have just a little bit, there's some plants growing. And then other times when you cross that threshold, you might have done too much. So somewhere in between here, there's probably a good happy medium we can find. Right to it. Here's some numbers. And this is from multiple studies keep coming up with the same kind of numbers throughout Colorado and the Intermountain West. So at about 3 inches, you start to kind of suppress some plants. After 6, you don't get much growing there. But the take home is that's in that one spot. How many of you think that the whole forest is covered in 6 inches of mulch ever? Almost never, right? Andy and I know one spot, but almost never. So here's some data from a regional study throughout all of Colorado about average mulch depths across different ecosystems from subalpine down to ponderosa, down to pinyon juniper, right? And if you look at the average mulch depths, you don't really need to know what basal area is or anything, but the most trees you would ever want to take out at the bottom there, your average depth across there is just 2.3 inches. That's way less than our 3 inches up there, right? So the average depth is the wrong thing to focus on, and that's what I see almost all prescriptions say. You must mulch the trees down to an average depth of no more than 3 inches across the site. Well, the contractors are almost always going to do that, but they might not hit your actual specs that you're looking for. So mulch depth is rarely deep enough over large areas to impact that plant establishment, impact the ecological processes at the site. And managing that mulch distribution is as important as the depth. It's those places where it is really deep that we care about. So let's talk about those and put that kind of stuff in our management implications, in our prescriptions, rather than average depths. Minimize those heavily mulched areas instead of focusing on the average. How long does mulch last? That's a question I get all the time. Well, studies have shown across Colorado, after about 9 or 10 years, roughly half of the mass of the mulch is decomposed and not there. But after 10 years, those same studies also show that it still burns. So even though it's decomposing, it's not rotten and non-combustible. It still flames and produces fire. So it lasts a long time. Especially in Colorado where it's cold and dry. Some trade-offs. Changes in fuel arrangement, right? So reducing that tree density, fewer small trees, fewer ladder fuels, we're solving our problem of less trees on the landscape. But we're increasing the small wood on the surface by a lot. And we're also compacting that fuel bed compared to other forest management actions. We're grinding it up and making it real flat and nice and pretty, right? So that has some implications for when mulch burns. So we're going to go through some objectives and try and drill down into what we're actually talking about. So in a mulched fuel bed, you might have reduced tree density, and then the fire behavior implication is maybe you'll have reduced active crown fire moving from tree to tree, right? You're going to have fewer small trees, fewer ladder fuels, so the fire is going to be less able to get up into individual single trees and start that crown fire. So what does that mean for our results? It means potentially increased fire suppression opportunities. Potentially, if you have a fire on the ground and they're not burning through all the treetops, potentially reduced tree mortality. Right? Any firefighter would rather have a fire on the surface rather than in treetops. even if there's tons of surface fuels and things, but if there's more opportunities if it's on the surface. Okay? Some other trade-offs though, there's more wood on the surface than in other practices compared to needle litter. Wood puts off more heat, it's just a fact of physics. Wood burns hotter than needles, right? The fuel bed is also more compacted. So these results in longer burn time, there's a lot longer duration of the fire, more soil heating potentially, and then this is where it gets complicated. There's more fuel on the ground, so there's potentially more fuel to burn, higher flame lengths, but because it's compacted, it also could be less. Kind of depends on your exact weather conditions, and actually the duff moisture underneath it is a key factor. So what does that mean? Longer durations, long burn durations complicates that suppression, right? Containment and control. If you have to sit and babysit a fire and you may not know exactly where all the hot spots are, then it's potential to also escape later. It also, we said on the top that if you do mastication, it might reduce tree mortality, but if you increase that soil heating and at the bottom, you could actually increase it with the surface fuels. So it kind of depends. All right, where's all this stuff going to be heading and found? I've been working on this. Some of you in the room actually might remember a couple years ago, the Front Range Roundtable asked questions about what do we do with mulch? I don't know. Some people love it, some people despise it. So we've been working on a science synthesis as well as step-by-step planning guideline that hopefully by December is my new deadline to try and get this out. All right, so what do we say? At the end of the day, we said average depth is not important. Here's what is important. Here's what resonates with managers, with implementers, with people out there, and can really increase that communication between people. You want to talk about the distribution of mulch, the maximum allowable mulch depth, the maximum mulch patch size, right? And specify this. A area of mulch cover will not exceed 100 square feet, 1 acre, whatever you want for your objectives. That's what people care about. That's where the problems are. So let's write it down. So there's just some guidelines on how to actually phrase that and better communicate it with people. Just drill down a little bit more. So we're just going to go through the distribution. I'll show you actually some examples of what we're coming up with how to phrase this. Okay, so just the distribution of mulch. Let's say your management goal is you're working in low elevation, dry, frequent fire forest, ponderosa kind of habitats, where you're expecting fire fairly regularly. And those forests are adapted to low severity surface fire, more or less. So your specification might be discontinuous coverage to minimize the ecological impacts, risk of that prolonged heating. These forests don't naturally have a lot of surface fuels. So maybe 40 to 60% covered mulch. Whereas if you're in higher elevation, moist, really high fuel loading, more productive areas, they're naturally more, there's more fuel on the ground. You're going to have more fuel on the ground if you're cutting more trees and mulching more trees. So the cover is going to be a lot higher, and maybe that's okay. So it's kind of a relative thing. We don't want to take these numbers and have everybody just say 40 to 60 and dump it into their management plans, but just a way to think about that. If you're doing a fuel break, and that's your main objective, no matter what ecosystem you're in, you want to make it as discontinuous as possible, minimize the accumulations near those containment lines so you can facilitate that containment and holding. But you also want to take out a lot of ladder fuels, right? So it's all kind of relative. If you're doing hazard tree removal, that's a great application of mulching. Then you're getting rid of your hazard trees, and you don't really care. You don't want trees to fall on people. You don't want trees to hit power lines. The mulch on the ground is less important. Except for you want to keep in mind those top two of what ecosystem you're working in and maybe try and do some ecological bit as well. All right, so there's different tools to achieve different objectives. When is mulching the right tool for the job? When there's no other options to remove or utilize the wood. I think everybody would rather find better uses of the wood. Sometimes you can't. And that's when mulching is potentially a good tool. When there's low amounts of biomass to manage. So some pinyon juniper systems, some forests with smaller trees, to manage tree regeneration. When trees are generally less than 8 inches, so if you're masticating a whole bunch of really big trees, you might want to stop and think about that before you keep going ahead. And it's really best, we found, as a complementary tool along with other forest management practices. When you're doing mulching just as a standalone tool, that's when you tend to get in trouble. And then, as Jim mentioned, and other people I'm sure are aware, zones 1 and 2 near houses, you want to move fuel as far away as possible. Get rid of it. So zones 1 and 2, there we recommend no mulching at all and move it away. So all tools have benefits and drawbacks, right? So what do we learn? Clear objectives, keep us happy, all the way up to level 7, I guess, somewhere in there. Focus on managing mulch distribution rather than average depth. And in severe fire weather, mulching can be a benefit, but there's also some potential drawbacks. So it kind of depends. Think about those mega fires and what we can actually manage for, and what the scale of that management needs to be. Lots of people helped with this. Thanks to Gloria for also helping out and pitching in with some funding to help move this project forward. And maybe a question or two on mulch.
I'm getting a little behind, so one, but we don't want Brett to have a chance.
All right.
You measured the oxygen levels in the mulch in the ground versus the chip
Have we measured that?
oxygen level.
Have we measured the oxygen levels? I don't think we measured the oxygen levels. We've measured nutrient cycling and things like that, and nitrogen levels, and it does change the first couple of years, but there's not long-term
Yeah, but I
detrimental
mean,
impacts.
for, fire, you need oxygen. And
Right.
on the ground,
So for fire, yes, the oxygen levels, that's what I was talking about, the more compact fuel bed. So the mixing and the fluffiness of the fuels, the more fluffy it is, the more it's going to burn. So that hasn't been explicitly measured to my knowledge, except for then the bulk density is what we call. So how much material you have in a certain depth. Mastication and mulching, you have a lot more material in a shorter depth. So the density is higher. Yeah.
I'd just like to toss in Colorado Forest Restoration Institute and Southern Rockies Fire Science Network recognize that this is a major issue throughout the Southern Rockies region, and there's lots of questions about this. That has almost pretty my ear, right back here. So if you have more questions, I'd like to just offer, if Brett, you have time to meet for questions at the Southern Rockies table at the end of the hall, then would you be up for that, Brett? Would that be okay?
If anyone has questions, I would be at the Southern Rockies table. I'd love to talk to you. Please, bring chocolate.